They laughed when he dropped the box. They laughed harder when his boss told him, "People like you should know their place." No one noticed the way his hands shook, not from fear, but from something quietly breaking. That day, he walked out with his head down and a plan no one saw coming. Because the most dangerous revenge isn't loud. It's patient.I in Australia. We like to believe in the fair go. We believe hard work should mean something, and dignity should never be optional. But for Daniel Harper, a warehouse worker in the outer suburbs of Melbourne, the fair go was just a phrase people said, not something he ever felt. This isn't a story about fists or shouting matches. This is a story about silence, endurance, and a revenge so unexpected it changed everyone who witnessed it. He never imagined that humiliation could become a spark. For most of his life, Daniel believed humiliation was something you swallowed, something you endured quietly like bad weather. Growing up, he was taught to keep his head down, do the work, don't answer back, and eventually things would get better. That belief followed him into adulthood, into the warehouse, into every long shift where his back ached and his name was spoken only when something went wrong. Each time his boss mocked him, each time laughter rippled across the room, Daniel felt himself shrink a little more. Not because he was weak, but because he was tired of fighting battles no one else seemed to notice. The day his boss humiliated him in front of everyone, something inside him cracked, but it didn't shatter. It sharpened. As Mark's words cut through the room, Daniel felt heat rise in his chest, not the hot anger that makes people explode, but a cold, focused awareness. In that moment, he realized something most people never do. Humiliation exposes truth. It strips away illusions. It shows you exactly where you stand and how others see you. And once you see that clearly, you're no longer blind. Daniel replayed that moment again and again in his head. The way Mark smirked. The way no one defended him. The way silence felt heavier than the insult itself. For days, it haunted him. But instead of drowning in it, he began asking himself hard questions. Why does this affect me so deeply? Why does his opinion have so much power over me? And most importantly, what am I going to do about it? That's when humiliation stopped being a wound and started becoming fuel. He realized that being underestimated gave him an advantage. No one watched him closely. No one thought he was capable of more than lifting boxes and following instructions. In their eyes, he was invisible. And invisibility, he learned, can be powerful. While others complained loudly in the break room, Daniel listened. While others scrolled on their phones, he observed. He noticed patterns, how certain safety checks were skipped when deadlines were tight, how overtime hours disappeared from records, how decisions were made behind closed doors and never explained. Every insult he endured added weight to his resolve. Instead of responding emotionally, he trained himself to respond intelligently. When his boss spoke down to him, Daniel stayed calm. When jokes were made at his expense, he said nothing. But inside, he was taking notes, not just about the workplace, but about himself. He was learning patience, discipline, control, the very traits his boss assumed he didn't possess. Humiliation taught Daniel something school never had: clarity. It showed him that respect isn't handed out fairly, and effort alone doesn't guarantee dignity. Systems matter. Knowledge matters. And understanding how power works is the first step to reclaiming your own. For the first time, Daniel stopped asking for approval and started preparing for accountability. There were nights he wanted to quit. Nights when the shame felt too heavy, when the idea of walking back into that warehouse made his stomach tighten. But then he remembered the look on his boss's face, the casual cruelty, the certainty that Daniel would never push back. And instead of giving up, he chose to grow quieter, sharper, more deliberate. Humiliation changed how Daniel saw himself. It forced him to confront a painful truth. He had allowed others to define his worth. But once he saw that clearly, he could take it back. Slowly, deliberately, without making a sound. He began reading policies, understanding worker rights, learning procedures most people ignored. Not out of revenge, but out of self-respect. He wasn't planning to hurt anyone. He was planning to protect himself and others like him. What no one tells you is that humiliation can be a teacher. A brutal one, yes, but honest. It reveals who stands with you, who benefits from your silence, and who fears being exposed. Daniel learned that day that being humiliated doesn't mean you are small. It means someone is trying to make you feel small because they sense potential they can't control. By the time his plan took shape, Daniel was no longer the same man who had stood frozen in that meeting. He was steadier, clearer, stronger in ways that didn't show on the surface. The humiliation hadn't broken him. It had refined him. It had stripped away fear and replaced it with purpose. And that's the truth most people miss. Humiliation can crush you, yes, but it can also wake you up. It can force you to stop seeking validation from those who benefit from denying it. It can turn pain into precision, silence into strategy, and weakness into quiet strength. Daniel never thanked his boss for humiliating him. He didn't need to. The lesson was already learned. And when the time came, when the truth finally surfaced and the balance of power shifted, it wasn't anger that carried him forward. It was a clarity born from being underestimated. Because sometimes, the moment they try to make you feel worthless is the moment you begin to realize just how dangerous your potential really is. Silence is often misunderstood. People see it as weakness, as fear, as the absence of courage. They assume that if you are quiet, you have accepted your place, that you have surrendered. Daniel used to believe that too. For years, his silence was born from uncertainty, the fear of losing his job, the fear of being judged, the fear that speaking up would only make things worse. But after the humiliation, his silence changed. It stopped being a shield for fear and became a tool of intention. At work, Daniel said less than ever. When Mark mocked him, he didn't react. When blame was thrown his way, he didn't argue. To the outside world, it looked like submission. People whispered that he had given up. Some even pitied him. What they didn't realize was that Daniel was no longer silent because he felt powerless. He was silent because he was listening. Every workplace has two conversations, the one held out loud and the one that happens underneath. Daniel began paying attention to the second. In meetings, he watched who spoke confidently and who avoided eye contact. He noticed when Mark changed his tone depending on who was present. He heard half-finished sentences, nervous jokes, and complaints disguised as humor. Silence allowed him to hear what noise never could. Daniel learned that people reveal the most when they think no one important is listening. Because Mark had written him off, he spoke freely around him. Policies were ignored out loud. Shortcuts were admitted casually. No one checks it anyway, Mark once said, laughing. Daniel didn't respond. He simply remembered. Silence also gave Daniel control over himself. Instead of reacting emotionally, he learned to pause. Each insult tested him, tempted him to snap back, to defend himself. But he understood something crucial. Reacting would give Mark what he wanted, proof of dominance. Silence denied him that. It shifted the balance. Quietly and subtly, the more Mark pushed, the calmer Daniel became. And that calm unsettled people. At night, Daniel reflected on everything he had heard. Silence during the day turned into preparation at night. He read. He researched. He cross-checked stories with policies. He discovered that many of the things he had been told to accept as normal were actually violations. His silence had bought him time to understand the system that was being used against him. There were moments when staying silent hurt more than speaking ever could. When co-workers were mistreated. When a young worker was injured. When wages went missing. Each time, Daniel felt the weight of his quiet choice. But he reminded himself that silence didn't mean inaction. It meant waiting for the right moment, the right channel, the right evidence. Daniel began to realize that silence can be strategic. In a world where everyone rushes to be heard, the quiet observer often sees the clearest. Silence allowed him to remain underestimated, and that underestimation was his greatest protection. No one suspected him. No one guarded their words around him. And so, the truth flowed freely. There is a difference between being silent because you are afraid and being silent because you are prepared. Daniel crossed that line without anyone noticing. His silence no longer drained him. It strengthened him. He was no longer seeking approval or defending his worth. He knew who he was becoming, even if no one else did. When people asked why he never stood up for himself, Daniel smiled faintly. They mistook that smile for defeat. In reality, it was restraint. He understood that timing matters. Speaking too early can destroy the very outcome you're working toward. Silence, when chosen deliberately, creates space. Space to gather truth, space to build strength, space to let others expose themselves. By the time Daniel finally spoke, his words carried weight. They weren't emotional. They weren't defensive. They were factual, documented, undeniable. And that is the power of strategic silence. When you finally break it, the sound echoes far louder than any shout ever could. Daniel's silence was never submission. It was patience. It was discipline. It was self-control in a world that mistakes loudness for strength. And when the moment came, his quiet endurance transformed into action that no one could ignore. Because sometimes, the bravest thing you can do isn't to raise your voice. It's to stay silent long enough to make sure that when you finally speak, the truth does all the talking for you. True power rarely looks the way people expect it to. Most imagine power as authority, loud voices, expensive suits, or the ability to intimidate others into obedience. Daniel once believed that too. He thought power belonged to people like Mac, men who stood at the front of rooms, who spoke without being questioned, who could humiliate someone publicly and face no consequences. For a long time, Daniel believed power was something you either had or you didn't, and he believed he didn't. That belief began to crumble the moment he started understanding the system around him. At first, Daniel's curiosity was accidental. After one especially long shift, he searched online for worker rights, not with any grand plan, but out of quiet frustration. He wanted to know whether what he was experiencing was normal, or whether it was something he was simply expected to endure. What he found surprised him. Policies, laws, procedures, rules that existed on paper but were never mentioned on the warehouse floor. The more he read, the more he realized how little he actually knew, and how much that ignorance had cost him. Knowledge didn't arrive all at once. It came slowly, in fragments. A clause here, a regulation there. He learned how overtime was meant to be recorded, how safety checks were legally required, how complaints were supposed to be handled. Each piece of information felt like a light switching on in a room he didn't know existed. And suddenly, he could see how the system worked and how it was being abused. Daniel realized something uncomfortable. Mark's power wasn't personal. It wasn't strength or intelligence. It was familiarity. Mark knew the system just well enough to bend it, and he relied on the fact that no one else did. He counted on fear and ignorance. He counted on workers being too tired, too busy, or too unsure to ask questions. The system wasn't broken. It was being exploited. Understanding that changed everything. Instead of seeing himself as a victim, Daniel began seeing himself as a student. He treated the workplace like a textbook. Every process, every form, every rule became something to study. When Mark dismissed safety checks, Daniel looked up the consequences. When pay discrepancies appeared, Daniel learned how audits worked. He didn't need permission to loan. The information was already there, hiding in plain sight. And the more Daniel understood, the less intimidating Mark became. Power shifted internally first. Daniel walked into work differently. Not taller, not louder, steadier. When Mark spoke, Daniel listened with a new awareness. He no longer heard authority. He heard risk. He heard violations. He heard confidence built on fragile ground. And that knowledge removed fear in a way nothing else ever had. There's a quiet confidence that comes from understanding the rules better than the person breaking them. Daniel felt it grow inside him. He no longer reacted to insults because he understood they were distractions. Smoke screens meant to keep people focused on emotion instead of facts. The system didn't care about Mark's tone or Daniel's feelings. It cared about evidence, documentation, and procedure. So Daniel focused on those. He learned how complaints actually move through channels. He learned the difference between rumors and reportable facts. He learned that timing mattered just as much as truth. Most importantly, he learned that systems reward preparation, not rage. Yelling could get you fired. Knowledge could get you protected. This understanding didn't make Daniel arrogant. It made him careful. He realized that knowing the system also meant respecting it. He didn't cut corners. He didn't exaggerate. He didn't act out of revenge. He waited until he understood enough to act without exposing himself or anyone else to unnecessary harm. There were moments when he wanted to confront Mark directly, armed with his new knowledge. But Daniel understood something crucial. Power isn't proven by confrontation. It's proven by outcome. And the outcome he wanted wasn't an argument. It was change. As weeks passed, Daniel saw how others were trapped the same way he once was. Good workers blaming themselves for systemic failures. People thinking they were weak when they were simply uninformed. That realization hardened his resolve. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about accountability. Knowing the system gave Daniel a sense of control he'd never felt before. Not control over people, control over his own future. He stopped feeling like a leaf in the wind, tossed around by someone else's authority. He understood where the lines were drawn and how they could be enforced. And once you know that, intimidation loses its power. When the time finally came to act, Daniel wasn't nervous. He wasn't angry. He was prepared. Every report he submitted followed procedure. Every claim was backed by evidence. Every step was calculated. Mark's confidence collapsed not because Daniel challenged him directly, but because the system did. The same system Mark believed would never turn against him. And that's the truth most people never learn. Systems are neutral. They don't care who you are, but they favor those who understand them. Daniel didn't gain power by becoming louder or more aggressive. He gained it by becoming informed, by replacing fear with understanding, by learning that real power doesn't come from breaking rules. It comes from knowing how to use them. In the end, Daniel didn't beat his boss with strength. He didn't outshout him. He outlearned him. And that kind of power is the most dangerous of all, because once you have it, no one can take it away from you. In the end, Daniel learned what most never do. Power doesn't belong to the loudest voice in the room. It belongs to the one who understands how the world really works. When you stop reacting and start learning, fear loses its grip and confidence takes its place. And once knowledge becomes your strength, no one can humiliate you again. They can only expose themselves.